presentation is all about the Gestalt Learning. Let's define what is Gestalt theory. Gestalt came from a German word that means pattern or form. Gestalt theories propose that the experiences and perceptions of the learners have a significant impact on the way that they learn. This theory attempts to describe how people tend to organize visual elements into groups or unified wholes when certain principles are applied. The human brain maps learning features to understand the whole instead of the sum of its part. Let's discuss the history and theories of Gestalt theory. The German theorist Graf Christian von Ehrenfels created the term Gestalt, who said that learning takes place as students were able to comprehend a concept in its entirety, rather than broken up into parts. The image in the upper right side was German theorist Graf Christian von Ehrenfels. Max Wiedermer was one of Ehrenfels' students, an Austro-Hungarian-born psychologist who was one of the three founders of Gestalt psychology, along with psychologists Max Wiedermer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kofka, who studied perception, concluded that learners were not passive, but rather active. Learners do not just collect information but they actively process and restructure data in order to understand it. Factors like past experiences, needs, attitude, and one's present situation can affect their perception. According to the Gestalt psychologists, the way we form our perceptions are guided by certain principles or laws. There are 6 individual principles commonly associated with Gestalt theory, namely similarity, continuation, closure, proximity, figure or ground, and symmetry and order, also called programs. The first principles of Gestalt theory is law of proximity. Define elements that are closer together will be perceived as coherent objects. Example below. The circles on the left appear to be grouped in vertical columns, while those on the right appear to be grouped in horizontal rows. The second principle is law of similarity. Define its human nature to be grouped like things together. In Gestalt, similar elements are visually grouped regardless of their proximity to each other. They can be grouped by color, shape, or size. Similarity can be used to tie together elements that may not be right next to each other in a design. Example below. Although those elements look the same and we eventually space, we tend to group them by color. The third principle of Gestalt theory is law of closure. We tend to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a space by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the figure. Example below. The principles of closure illustrated in the World Wildlife Fund Panda logo. The brain completes the white shapes even though they are not well defined. The fourth principle of Gestalt theory is law of good continuation. Individuals have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. People tend to draw a good continuous line. Example below. In the image below, the top branch is seen as continuing the first segment of the line. This allows us to see things as flowing smoothly without breaking lines up into multiple parts. The fifth principle of Gestalt theory is law of figure or ground. We separate full figures from their backgrounds based on one or more of a number of possible variables. Example image below. Some people will immediately see the tree when viewing the logo, while others will see the gorilla and lion staring at each other. The sixth figure is law of good fragrance. The law of symmetry in order is also known as pragnance, the German word for good figure. What this principle says is that your brain will perceive ambiguous shapes in as simple as manner as possible. Example image below. A monochrome version of the Olympic logo is seen as a series of overlapping circles rather than a collection of curved lines. Insight learning. The idea of insight learning was first developed by Wolfgang Kohler, in which he describes experiments with apes, where apes could use boxes and sticks as tools to solve problems. In each of these problems, the important aspect of learning was not reinforcement, but the coordination of thinking to create new organization of materials. Kohler referred to this behavior as insight or discovery learning. Kohler proposed the view that insight follows from the characteristic of object under consideration. His theory suggested that learning could occur when an individual perceives the relationships of the elements before him and reorganizes these elements and comes to a greater understanding or insight. Learning could occur without reinforcement and or once it occurs, no review, training, or investigation is essential. Gestalt principles in teaching learning process. Kurt Lewin's theory. An individual has inner and outer forces that affect his perceptions. Inner forces include his own motivation, attitude, and feelings, while outer forces may include the attitude and behavior of the teacher and the classmate.